3, right?
3 people. Are we ready to start?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so we'll start first with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody. Happy New Year to you. I have to apologize for actually holding the class this morning. At 6:15, Kaidi called me and then she asked whether I would hold the class this morning. And then I looked on the computer, it's called weather.com, for, you enter the zip code and it tells you what the weather forecast is for the area. And it said just light snow showers, 70% of light snow showers. And so I thought the weather would be today like it was yesterday, just a little dust, snow dust. But then when I stepped out at about 9 o'clock this morning, I saw it was snowing fairly heavily. So normally in this weather like this, I would have canceled the class. But the weather is not always predictable. Anyway, I thank you for coming. Some of you maybe have driven a fair distance to get here. Okay, so today we will be taking Sutta number 8 in the Majjhima Nikāya. This is called the Discourse on Effacement, and this begins on page 123. First, the word that is used for the title of the sutta, the word that's translated as effacement. It's not a very common word in English, but the word in Pali is Sallekha. The word Sallekha, it's based on the verbal form. The verb root is leak, giving the verb lekati, which means to scratch. And then the prefix sang sort of strengthens that meaning. And so the idea of Sallekha seems to be originally something like scratching off, removing something by scratching it away. So it takes on the sense of eliminating or erasing. And it seems to have been a term that was used maybe in the time of the Buddha, not only by the Buddha himself, but in the various ascetic communities that were flourishing during that period, to mean the process of eliminating defilements, mental defilements, often by undertaking ascetic practices, for example, by fasting for long periods, by wearing rough clothes, in some cases by going naked all the time, or by bathing in cold lakes during the cold season, or exposing oneself to the sun during the hot season. And so the idea underlying this word is that by undertaking these austerities, one is facing one's own resistance to these unpleasant conditions, and in this way one is overcoming defilements. But the Buddha took this term and then gave it a new meaning, which accorded with his own teaching, which is the elimination of defilements not by undergoing these ascetic practices, which many of them the Buddha found to be actually useless for the purpose of mental purification, but rather eliminating the defilements by training the mind in certain ways. And we'll come later in the sutta to see how the Buddha explains or interprets this idea of effacement, the radical elimination of defilements. Okay, so the sutta begins one time when the Buddha was living in Savatthi. This is the Jeta's grove, Anathapindika's monastery at Savatthi. And so one day, one of the Buddha's disciples, whose name was the Venerable Mahachunda, he was one of the great Arahant disciples of the Buddha. He came to the Buddha and he asked a question. And it seems since Mahachunda was already an Arahant, one who was completely liberated in mind, he wasn't asking this question so much for his own sake, but rather for the sake of his own disciples. It's probable that he had some of his disciples come along with him to the Buddha, and he wanted to get the Buddha's own advice on this particular question for the sake of his disciples. So he speaks first about various views that arise in the world that are associated either with doctrines of a self or with doctrines about the world. The expression used here in the Pali is attavada and lokavada, doctrines about the self, doctrines about the world. And these two subjects, these were the main topics of philosophical inquiry and speculation during the Buddha's time, perhaps for even 2 centuries or so before the arising of the Buddha. So the Indian thinkers during this period were, originally they were perplexed by questions about what is the real nature of the self, and what is the real nature of the world. Did you get a copy? Yes. The woman in the far back in the corner didn't get a copy. Okay, so they were troubled by these questions. What is the real nature of the self? What is the real nature of the world? And then as they launched into their investigations of this question, at least the leading thinkers during this period came to the conclusion that within the person, at the center of the human being or any living being, there is some permanent nucleus of individual identity, which is called the Atman, the self. And then they also examined the nature of the world. And then they came to the conclusion that underlying the world that appears to us, there is a permanent, stable, unchanging reality, which they called Brahman. And so then the question became, what is the relationship between the real self and the true reality of the world, the Atman and Brahman? Getting the signal, low battery. Sorry.
It's okay.
It's good that you're here.
So it can work? It still can work now?
It can still work,
Okay.
but my voice might start to fade out in a couple of
Okay.
minutes. Okay, so some came to the conclusion that the Atman and the Brahman were essentially the same. That is, that reality within oneself, that permanent reality within oneself, existing in the innermost, one's innermost being. Sometimes it's said to be dwelling in the center of the heart. That reality is the same as the ultimate reality of the world. This was the message of the Upanishads. At least it's the dominant message of the Upanishads, the oldest Upanishads. That Atman, the innermost true self, is identical with Brahman, the real permanent reality behind the world. Other thinkers came to still other conclusions. Some held that the Atman and the Brahman, or the self and the world, were different, but each was a permanent reality in its own right. And then some came to the conclusion that the self arises with birth and lasts through the course of one's life, and then completely passes away and perishes at death. And so there was a wide variety of views about the self and the world that were thriving during the Buddha's time. And in the first sutta of the Bhikkhu Nikāya, called the Brahmajala Sutta, the Buddha has classified 62 current views about the self and the world. And the aim of the Buddha's teaching is not to arrive at a fixed view about the self and the world, because the Buddha understood that all of these views are different manifestations of craving or clinging. And so the aim for the Buddha's teaching is to overcome all fixed views about the self and the world. And so for this reason, when Mahachunda comes to the Buddha to open a discussion, he asks about how one goes about abandoning and relinquishing all of these views. How one goes about abandoning and relinquishing all of these views that concern the self or the world. And so he phrases the question, I have to say it's a little bit obscure in the Pali, even to myself. So he says, now does the abandoning and relinquishing of those views come about in a bhikkhu, a monk, who is attending only to the beginning? Then the commentary says, areas of his meditative training. I won't try to explicate this sentence because it's rather obscure to me as well, and we don't find it repeated elsewhere in the suttas. But the Buddha's answer is what's important. The Buddha says, as to these various views that arise in the world, associated either with the doctrines of a self or with doctrines about the world, if in relation to those views, if in relation to that object on the basis of which those views arise, which they underlie, and which they are exercised upon, if one sees this object as it actually is with proper wisdom, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, then the abandoning and relinquishing of those views comes about. Okay, this is a rather complicated way of saying that, I'll try to rephrase this in a simpler way. The way to overcome all of these views that arise concerning the nature of the self, the nature of the world, is to contemplate anything on the basis of which those views are formed as this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. And according to the Buddha's teachings, when any views are formed about the self or about the world, they're all formed on the basis of what we call the 5 aggregates. That is, the 5 constituents of conditioned existence. Physical form, or the body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, volitional activities, and consciousness. And so the Buddha, whereas other thinkers in the Buddha's time formed the view, myself is the body, myself is feeling, myself is perception, myself are volitional activities, myself is consciousness. The Buddha developed this radical teaching of non-self, anatta, that the way to overcome all of these binding views, these entangling views, is by turning this whole idea of the self on its head and instead adopting the standpoint of non-self, observing whatever one identifies with, whatever one clings to as being mine or myself, contemplating it, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. And that is, we might call that is the essence or the crux of insight meditation, the meditation aimed at developing panya, wisdom. And so often one begins, sometimes usually with impermanence, because it's the most obvious characteristic. From there one comes to dukkha, whatever is impermanent is unsatisfactory, connected with suffering, defective. And then based on impermanence and dukkha, one comes to non-self. Whatever is impermanent, connected with suffering, is not myself. So that is the gradual, step-by-step way of developing insight. But for those with very sharp faculties, don't jump to the conclusion. Let's not jump to the conclusion we belong in that category. But for those few rare ones with very sharp faculties, the Buddha can just begin directly by saying, contemplate that as not mine, not I, not myself. And then that brings the breaking of identification, ending of identification, through uprooting of all of these views about the nature of the self, the nature of the world. Okay, now the Buddha, without being questioned further by Mahachunda, he enters upon a somewhat, it seems to be a different topic, but it seems as though he's going beyond the original question by taking up the idea of what is called effacement. This is Sallekha, the word that gives the title to the sutta. So it's a little bit puzzling. What is the connection between the way the Buddha continues the sutta and the opening question? It seems to me almost as if something is missing from the dialogue. Maybe something went on in the exchange that just wasn't preserved and transmitted. But maybe the connection is that the elimination of views about the self, that is perhaps the ultimate type of effacement, elimination. But what seems to have been the case, at least according to the commentary, is that some of Chunda's disciples, his pupils, were able to attain the higher meditative states of samadhi. And they thought that by attaining these states of samadhi, that they were practicing effacement, the elimination of defilements. And so the Buddha wants to make it clear that simply the attainment of samadhi by itself doesn't qualify as real effacement, the real elimination of defilements. So in the next section, he enters into the discussion of the 8 meditative attainments. First, he takes the 4 jhanas. These are the 4 meditative absorptions. I'm not going to explain the formulas right now. We'll take them up in a later class. But the Buddha begins by saying, here it's possible that some monk will enter and dwell in the first jhana, and he might think, I am abiding in effacement. That is, I'm eliminating the defilements. But then the Buddha says, in the Noble One's discipline, that is in the training, the path of the Noble Ones, that attainment of the first jhana is not called effacement, but that is called simply a pleasant abiding here and now in this very life, in this present life, in this present life. Okay, so now the Buddha himself, we have to remember, the Buddha includes the jhanas in his formulation of the Noble Eightfold Path. So when we look at the definition of right concentration, sama samadhi, it's given as the 4 jhanas. And so the Buddha includes the jhanas in the path, but the reason that the Buddha says that the practice of the jhanas doesn't qualify as effacement, that is because the Buddha is here speaking with reference to those who merely attain the jhanas and don't use them as a basis or foundation for going further to develop wisdom. But they simply attain the jhana and then they experience the bliss and peace of the jhana and they think that is sufficient. Now I'm doing the work of eliminating defilements. But the Buddha says the jhana in itself, it's not enough. It's just a very blissful, happy, pleasant state of mind. But don't get stuck there, but go further to develop your insight, your wisdom. Okay, then the text goes through the 4 jhanas, each one in the same way. 2nd jhana, 3rd jhana, 4th jhana. Each one, the Buddha says, is simply, in the Noble One's discipline, it's simply called a pleasant abiding here and now. Then, paragraph 8, he begins with the 4 stages of samadhi that lie beyond the 4 jhanas. These are the 4 formless meditations, or immaterial, non-material meditations. Okay, so the Buddha begins with the lowest, is called the sphere or base of infinite space. And so he speaks about a monk who enters the base of infinite space and thinks, I am dwelling in effacement. But the Buddha says that is, in the Noble One's discipline, that is not called effacement, but that is called a peaceful abiding. That is, the 4 jhanas are pleasant abidings, but the 4 formless meditations are even beyond the pleasure or bliss of the jhanas, and so they're called very peaceful or tranquil states of mind. And so the Buddha goes through the base of infinite space, base of infinite consciousness, base of nothingness, base of neither perception nor non-perception. In each case, he says, even though the monk might think, I'm dwelling in effacement, but actually, from the standpoint of the Noble One, the one who's achieved true realization, that state in itself is not effacement, but it is simply a peaceful or calm abiding. Okay, so now this, what we've covered so far, is sort of building up to the main topic of the sutta, which is what starts in the next section, and that is how effacement should be practiced in the Noble One's discipline. And so that now the Buddha begins the instruction, and we now come to 44 different aspects or modes of effacement. And so the Buddha begins by saying, it's an interesting formulation, others will be cruel or harmful here, but we shall not be cruel. We shall not be harmful, violent, or aggressive here. Effacement should be practiced thus. And so there are 2 things interesting about this first passage. The first point is that the Buddha begins with what is called avihingsa, which means harmlessness. Even the translation is non-cruelty. It's not exactly accurate. But vihingsa means harming others, inflicting violence or destruction on others. And so the Buddha begins with harmlessness, not harming others, as the foundation for the whole practice of his teaching. So in Pali, this is called avihingsa, which means, here it would be translated non-cruelty, but it might be better to translate it as harmlessness, not harming others. And you might know the Pali word, the variant on it has almost come into English, and that is the word ahimsa. I think it was through Gandhi that that word entered into the English language. And it's basically the same word as avihingsa. Avihingsa just has a prefix V. And so this word came through from, actually originally from Buddhism and Jainism. It came into the thought of Gandhi. Then I think from Gandhi it came into, I'm not sure whether Martin Luther King actually used the word ahimsa, but it also is the word that underlies the practice of nonviolent resistance that Martin Luther King adopted. Okay, so the foundation for the whole practice of effacement, the starting point, is not inflicting harm on any other living being. And the second way this statement is interesting is that the way this determination is formulated, others might be cruel or harmful, but we shall not be cruel or harmful here. This shows that or at least the way I interpret it, it shows that when one sets out on this path of cultivation, self-cultivation, often it involves a break away from what the crowd is doing. So our tendency, within the world is to look, what are others doing? And I should do the same thing. Like in the world of fashion, people are always asking, what are they wearing nowadays? Like I remember when I was a young boy, I used to go shopping with my mother. I would like a shirt, maybe a shirt or a jacket, and my mother would say, oh, but they're not wearing that these days. But I would think, I like the shirt. Oh, but how can you wear that? How can you choose that? They're not wearing the shirt. And so it eventually reached the point where in my 20s I said, I want to wear a robe like this. And my mother said, but they're not wearing robes like that these days. It's 2,500-year-old style. But Mom, I like it. Okay, so now we might see other people acting violently, cruelly, harming others, but we have to make this determination, no matter how others behave, we won't follow in their footsteps. We have our own path to follow. Okay, so from the starting point of non-harming, non-cruelty, the Buddha next goes into various other factors that constitute effacement. And many of these factors fall into fixed groups that occur elsewhere in this teaching. So we next come to 10 factors which constitute what are called the 10 courses of wholesome karma, 10 ways of wholesome action. First, 3 of body, that is abstaining from killing living beings, abstaining from stealing, abstaining from, in the case of, he's speaking to monks, so he says, observing celibacy. In the case of lay people, it's abstaining from sexual misconduct. Then come 4 of speech, to abstain from false speech, from malicious or divisive speech, abstaining from harsh speech, and abstaining from gossip or idle chatter. And then come 3 of mind, abstaining from not giving rise to covetousness. That means a possessive mind, a mind which wants to get possession of the belonging, which wants to take possession of the belongings of others. Having a mind without ill will, that's a mind of loving kindness towards others. And having right view, especially as the foundation, the right view of the principle of karma and its result, its fruit. Okay, now, right view it's the 10th of the 10 courses of wholesome karma, but it's also the first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. And so now we come to the next 7 factors, are the 7 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. And right view actually belongs to both groups, so it's not repeated. So we could actually start again from number 11 with holding right view. Then we come to 12, having right intention or right purpose, right motivation. Then right speech, right action, right livelihood. Then right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Okay, then when the Noble Eightfold Path is brought to fulfillment, it culminates in right knowledge and right liberation. So right knowledge and right liberation are brought in as factors 19 and 20. Okay, then we have 3 factors here. Sloth and torpor, or also we can call this dullness and drowsiness, and their opposite being free from sloth and torpor. Then we have restlessness and being free from restlessness, and then having doubt and being free from doubt. Okay, does anybody see those 3 factors as belonging to a particular group?
Hindrances? The hindrances?
Right. Those are 3 of the 5 hindrances. But why aren't the other 2 mentioned? Any ideas?
Well, they've already been mentioned.
That's right. They were already mentioned. They were already mentioned under 9 and 10. So that actually often the first hindrance is mentioned as sensual desire in the suttas, but sometimes when it's expressed, that's expressed as covetousness. And so being free from covetousness includes being free from sensual desire. And then number 10 here is being without ill will. That means being free from the hindrance of ill will. So those 2 factors should be connected with numbers 21, 22, and 23. And so we have overcoming the 5 hindrances. Then we have a number of factors that you will recognize from the previous class. These are some of the 16 mental defilements mentioned in Sutta number 7, the simile of the cloth. So we have here not being angry. Actually, anger is in some ways similar to ill will, except maybe it has a different way of manifestation. Whereas ill will is like a persisting dislike for others and a wish for others to undergo harm. Anger is something which flares up. It could be directed at people or directed at conditions, circumstances. And it's a kind of boiling in the mind, which then can subside. Okay, others will be resentful, we shall not be resentful here. This is like a persisting ill will against somebody turns into resentment or hostility. Then comes contempt, looking down on others, being insolent, being envious, being avaricious, being fraudulent, being deceitful, being obstinate, arrogant. Okay, those were all included amongst the 16 defilements of the mind. And so the task in training is to overcome these defilements of the mind. And that is what the Buddha calls a way of practicing effacement. Then he comes to a few other factors which are brought in. They're almost miscellaneous. He says, others will be difficult to admonish, difficult to correct, but we shall be easy to admonish. That is, when somebody points out one's faults, instead of reacting angrily to them and becoming insistent on adhering to one's faults and criticizing the other person in turn, one is willing to accept the advice of others and to change one's bad ways. So that's being easy to speak to, easy to correct, easy to admonish. Then, what's very important is the choice of one's friends. So the Buddha, in many suttas, insists on the need to avoid bad friends. That is, friends who will lead you astray, lead you into unwholesome ways of conduct, and to associate with good people, with people who embody good qualities, who can serve as a good example, can give good advice, people who are worthy of emulation. So you should avoid bad friends and associate with good friends. Others might be negligent or sloppy, careless or reckless in their behavior, but we shall be diligent or vigilant or heedful. Others will be, actually faithless has a special meaning in English, which is not quite the same here. Maybe others will be with, it's funny the way words take on a particular nuance in a language. Faithless means in a marriage relationship, when one partner doesn't remain faithful to the other, that's being faithless. But what's meant here is being without saddha, without faith, in the case of the Buddhist and the Triple Gem, or at least faith in good, wholesome qualities. But we shall be faithful here. Also, faithful means being loyal in a marriage relationship. But what is meant here is having faith, being possessed of faith, faith in the Dharma, faith in wholesome qualities. Others will be shameless, but we shall, again, this is not quite right, be shameful here. It means we shall have a kind of sense of self-respect so that we don't practice unworthy deeds, sort of throw to the winds our sense of self-respect, our sense of inner dignity, and just behave in unworthy ways. Others will have no fear of wrongdoing here. That is, they're not afraid of the consequences of doing wrong. But we shall have this fear of wrongdoing, fear of the consequences of doing wrong. These two qualities, shame, or what I call the sense of self-respect, and fear of wrongdoing, these together the Buddha calls the guardians of the world, or the protectors of the world, because they're the two qualities that motivate us to engage, to avoid what is unwholesome, and to engage in wholesome activities. But the two work in somewhat different ways. We could say that they're complementary ways. The sense of shame, or the sense of self-respect, holds us back from doing what is wrong, what is unwholesome, because we have the sense of our own inner dignity, our own potential nobility. And so we recognize this potential for purity, for wisdom within ourselves, and we don't want that potential to be sullied or defiled by behaving in improper ways. And so, through adherence to that sense of self-respect, we want to uphold our inner dignity. And for that reason, we draw back when we're tempted to do what is unwholesome, what is blameworthy. The other quality, the complementary quality, is fear of wrongdoing. Or we might also translate this moral dread. I'll put these Pali words on the board. Okay, what is called, or translated here as the sense of shame, or what I would call the sense of inner dignity, that is hiri. And then the word ottappa is what is translated as fear of wrongdoing. So ottappa means that one resists the temptation to do what is wrong, what is unwholesome, because one is afraid of the consequences. This could be fear of the karmic consequences, the long-range karmic results of one's unwholesome behavior. But it could also include fear of being found out by others, and then being blamed and criticized by others. Like, for example, recently, Tiger Woods, even if he didn't have the sense of hiri, a sense of shame or his inner dignity, but he didn't have the ottappa, the fear that his whole career potentially can be ruined once he's found out, and then he'll be ridiculed, blamed, criticized, everybody reading about this on the news, about this misbehavior. And so if he had that, then he would have restrained himself from his sexual affairs with other women. Okay, so these two qualities go together, the sense of shame and the fear of consequences. Okay, then come some other factors that are brought in. Being of little learning, and then one should strive to be of great learning. That should apply especially to you who've registered for this class. So always try to read the suttas, take notes, to learn the essential points. And then you become, over time, Bahu Sutta, of great learning. Others will be lazy, we shall be energetic here. Others will be unmindful, we shall be established in mindfulness here. Others will lack wisdom, we shall possess wisdom here. Actually, these factors, faith, shame, fear of wrongdoing, being of much learning, being energetic, being mindful, having wisdom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those 7 factors go together into a group which are called the 7 good qualities. They're mentioned as a group in Sutta number 53 in the Majjhima Nikāya. In Pali, they're called the 7 Saddhamma. Here the prefix sad means good, and then Dhamma here has the sense of qualities. So these are 7 qualities of what is called a good person or a saintly person. Having faith, a sense of shame or self-respect, fear of consequences, having learning, being energetic, mindful, and possessing wisdom. Then the 44th and last, it's really important, and we have to be thankful that the Buddha points this out to us, since it's a quality to which all human beings are naturally subject, and that is adhering to their own views, holding on to them tenaciously, insisting upon them. My view is right, others are wrong, and then relinquishing them with difficulty. So even when you're showing proof, what you're saying is wrong, this is correct, you still sort of distort the proof, you refuse to look at it, you insist on your own view. So this is maybe the sickness of clinging to one's own views, just because it happens to be the view that you like. And so the virtue, according to the Buddha, is that one should have the mind, the determination. We shall not adhere to our own views or hold on to them tenaciously, but we should relinquish them easily. This is a quality that when I first became involved with Buddhism, I had to learn a hard way, because maybe this is the way university students are trained in the US, is that you always are taught that you have to defend your own view, stand up and defend yourself. And so if you form an opinion, then you have to be ready to argue for it. You don't surrender to the other person. Maybe that's why we have debating teams in high school and colleges, so that you learn to defend your own view. And so when I started to read about Buddhism many years ago, when I was associated with my first Buddhist teacher, then he had been a monk for like 20 years or so, and I was a few months reading about Buddhism. But I would read something in a book, and then I thought, this is what is said in the book. My teacher says something else, so I take what's in the book and I argue with him, and I would always be very insistent on my opinion. And then when he would refuse to accept my view, then I would come to sort of crash descent, a crash landing. It would really upset me and make me furious with anger. And so he taught me, gave me a very useful lesson, that whenever you get into a disagreement with somebody about views, always think, I might be right, I might be wrong, that's not important. But what's important is to find out what is true. And so he taught me in those days, because I used to have that tendency so strongly, he told me that every day in the morning after you get up, you should say to yourself, if I get into an argument with anybody, I might be right, I might be wrong, that is not important. What's important is to find out the truth. And so I did that for a while, and then I found that tendency to cling to my own views started to fade away. It still hasn't gone yet, after all these years. 44 modes of effacement. Does anybody have any questions on any of them? Or any comments?
You mentioned that the right view in the Noble Eightfold Path refers to the four jhanas. Is
Right concentration.
right concentration. I'm sorry. And is the assess concentration before the first jhana ever mentioned in any sutra as part of the right concentration?
It's not a... Yeah, access concentration first is not, the expression is not used in the suttas at all. It's the expression access concentration first appears in texts like Visuddhimagga and the commentaries. And so we don't actually find this expression access concentration in the suttas. But there are some occasions where the Buddha speaks about samadhi or concentration in connection with certain meditation subjects, which seem to me unlikely to lead to jhana. For example, in relation to recollection of the Buddha, recollection of the Dhamma, recollection of the Sangha, those are the recollection of the three jewels, the recollection of virtue or sila, generosity, the recollection of death. And so those are meditation subjects which use a fair amount of thought, thinking activity. And so because they use thinking activity, they don't lead to, it seems that they can't lead to jhana. And yet the Buddha says that they are the basis for samadhi. So my conjecture would be that the samadhi that they lead to would be what is called access concentration in the commentaries, in the Visuddhimagga and commentaries. Now the definition of right concentration given that we find in the suttas, in various suttas which define the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, is always given as the four jhanas. And so some monks or interpreters, they come to the conclusion that the attainment of jhana is necessary to qualify as right concentration. But I'm not in agreement with this. It seems to me that, at least for the attainment of the stage of stream entry, even the stage of once returning, those stages can be achieved without the prior attainment of full jhana. They could be achieved on the basis of a concentration which would be equivalent to access concentration. Nakawa, is that the way you pronounce it? Nagawa. Nagawa.
I just was looking at with the views. That's such a, in life, it's such a tricky thing because, you know, sometimes you know in your heart that you're right. Let's say the climate. I mean, people.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I think it's the anger and the hostility behind, you know, the view. But if you can.
Oh yeah. Definitely, I have to make that point. Yeah. Sometimes
you're just right. That's
yeah,
it.
if you're right, definitely you should stay with your right view. It doesn't mean that you have to give up your view, submit to the other when you have a disagreement.
Right, but then I guess what we're saying is that you maintain harmony anyway, regardless. You're not going to be the last one to get the right word in, and you're not going to.
Yeah. I think it's that attitude of clinging to one's view. So that one definitely should maintain one's view if one thinks that it's reasonable and it has evidence behind it. But it's that attitude that this is my view, so I have to cling to it and insist on it because it's mine.
There's a certain amount of clinging to it because you know ultimately it's right.
Yeah, but you should uphold let's say one should uphold one's view if one knows it's right, especially in situations where the triumph of a correct view is very important, and it's important, say, ethical and social consequences, like those who deny climate change, global warming. If their view were to prevail and everybody were to accept the idea that, in the words of this Senator James Inhofe, that global warming might be the greatest hoax ever perpetuated, how do you put it, greatest hoax ever imposed upon the American people. So if that view were to prevail, then we wouldn't try to do anything about global warming, and then it would just continue to escalate with destructive consequences. Okay, so one has to maintain one's position, but I think it's the subjective attitude that's intended here.
Because I think too, I know in my own experience, when I, like you said, cling too much to views, the anger it starts to brew. You could feel the heat arising.
Yeah.
So once you feel that heat, you have to kind of, back down and, say, whoa, I think this is headed right here.
Yeah, but it's a matter of training the mind, and also that sentence for recollection that my first teacher had given me, I might be right, I might be wrong, that's not important. What's important is to find out the truth. But in situations where you're on fairly solid ground and believing that you have the truth, then you should stand firm in adherence to the truth. Okay, in the back.
These 44 practices for effacement are a form of self-cultivation.
Yeah.
But then there's this term non-self. I think linguistically it's hard for me to reconcile. Why am I cultivating the self if I'm not that?
Okay. Okay, what the Buddha teaches is that the factors of experience, the factors of our being that we cling to as being myself, these are the factors that are non-self, in the sense that they're not a permanent, lasting, substantial entity, or that they don't constitute a basis for persisting personal identity. But they're still I would call the empirical person existing as a reality. The empirical person is not a single substantial entity, but it's a complex, conditionally arisen phenomena made up of a number of components. Okay, now this empirical person continues through time, and depending upon our choices, our actions, the direction we take, whether we cultivate ourselves properly or we become heedless, that will determine our destiny, whether we are moving towards happiness and freedom or bondage and suffering. And so even though there's no sort of solid individual permanent self, but the empirical person continues. And so what we have to do is to create, or to cultivate in the present, those factors in our being that will be the causes and conditions for positive development in the future. And then those will bring us happiness, freedom, wisdom in the future. Any further questions? Okay, then I'll take the internet questions. Okay, question 1. What is wrong deliverance? That's factor number 20. or wrong liberation. Actually, interestingly, there's no concrete explanation of this given in the suttas. So all I could do is offer speculation. It could be taking one of the meditative attainments, like the jhanas or formless meditations, to be true liberation. Or else it could be the view that was held by some in the Buddha's time that one should just feel free to indulge oneself in the 5 types of sensual pleasure. Form, sounds, delightful form, sounds, odors, tastes, touches. That is true liberation. Question number 2, does factor number 44 mean that Buddhists should not hold on to any ideology or maybe any ideas? I think that's pretty much the same point I already covered in the question from Nakawan. So one should definitely hold on to ideas one takes to be right and that seem to be reasonable. Okay, are these 44 effacement practices another way to state the 37 factors of enlightenment? The Eightfold Path is among them, but otherwise a few of the others correspond to the 37 factors of enlightenment, but they're not entirely the same. Then the question, is there mention of access concentration anywhere in the suttas? As I said, the word or the expression access concentration isn't found in the suttas. There's upachara samadhi in Pali, but there are some types of samadhi mentioned in the suttas that seem to be the basis for access concentration. Okay, does self-respect, fear of wrongdoing, and karmic consequences mean that while there is non-self, there is not no self? Not so clear. But anyway, as I said in answer to the earlier question, the teaching of non-self means that there is no sort of inner nucleus of personal identity, but there is the empirical person, or we could even call this the empirical self. So the Buddha says you should purify oneself, one should cultivate oneself, one should train oneself. And this is not referring to some kind of permanent or substantial lasting self, but it's a way of indicating you should cultivate one's own person so that one will establish the right conditions for receiving the desirable results. Okay, I want to move on and just quickly try to end the sutta, because the rest can be covered. It's a bit repetitive. Runs through the 44 factors, but just with this, each one with a slightly different slant. Okay, in paragraph number 13, the Buddha is saying, he says, I say that even the inclination of mind towards wholesome states is of great benefit. So what should be said of bodily and verbal acts conforming to that state of mind? Here what's called the state of the inclination of mind literally means the arousing of the mind. It's chitta. Might be rendered making a resolution or making a determination towards wholesome states. This would be like the Chinese fa shen. So this shows, and then the Buddha illustrates this by saying the mind should be inclined, or one should make the resolution thus: others will be cruel, we shall not be cruel here. So even if one can't undertake the actual practice, but set up this resolution or determination, just as on the New Year, we begin by making New Year's resolutions. I'm going to give up smoking, give up drinking, give up hanging out in maybe nightclubs. So I'm going to start a new life. But when people make that determination, if they don't repeat it every day, then a week, 10 days go by, then it's smoking again, drinking again, going to the nightclub again. But when you make the resolution every day. What I often suggest to people is to find, out of this list of 44, just find 3 or 5 qualities. Don't think of 44, it's too much. Or any 3 to 5 qualities, good qualities that you want to cultivate. And then make the determination that every day I'm going to develop these qualities. I'm going to eliminate these bad qualities, develop these good qualities. And when you make that determination every day, you find that the mind, little by little, even if it's resistant, it will move towards those wholesome qualities. Okay, so that's repeated for all 44 factors. Then, the next one is interesting. This is called, it's given the heading avoidance. So the Buddha begins with a simile. Suppose there were an uneven path or a rough path, and then there was another even path by which to avoid it. Or when, say, a road is being repaired, a public highway is being repaired, then the state authorities will open up a detour so that you can reach your destination avoiding the road that's under repair. Or suppose there were an uneven or dangerous ford, a place for crossing the river, and another even ford, a safe place by which to avoid it. So then, if you had any sense, you would take that safe, secure ford. And so, for all of these unwholesome ways of behavior, the Buddha has laid down the wholesome way by which to avoid it. So if one is given to harming others, then one has the principle of harmlessness or non-violence by which to avoid it. If one is given habitually to killing living beings, then one takes the precept to abstain from killing living beings. And so for each of these other factors, the mental states, you have just the resistance to that mental state by which to avoid it. And so that applies to all 44 ways. Okay, then we come on page 130. Here the text points out the direction in which these unwholesome states and wholesome states lead. So they lead in opposite directions. The unwholesome states lead downwards. That is, when one engages in those unwholesome states, they can become habitual. Once they become habitual, they become the determinants of your character. that once they become the determinants of your character, then they become the determinants of your destiny. And as determinants of your destiny, they'll lead downwards to states of deprivation, and in the process of rebirth, they'll lead to lower states of rebirth. So people who have unwholesome character traits, those character traits, if it's like the animal character traits, that will be the tendency to be reborn as an animal. If it's a very greedy, avaricious, niggardly character trait, that is the basis for the rebirth as a preta, or hungry ghost. And if it's a very hateful, vicious, mean, violent, destructive character, it could lead to rebirth in the hell realms. And so those unwholesome states lead downwards, and the wholesome states will lead upwards. So when we do good deeds, those deeds become the seeds of new habits, of good habits. The good habits form our character, and our character forms our destiny. So when we engage in these good deeds, they become the basis for a happy rebirth in the human realm, in the heavenly or celestial realms, and for the attainment of Nibbana, liberation. Okay, then this last section seems to be spoken in order to maybe to temper the premature enthusiasm of those who want to go about teaching and transforming others. So the Buddha says that one who is himself sinking in the mud, should pull out another who is sinking in the mud. That is impossible. But that one who is not himself sinking in the mud should pull out another sinking in the mud, that is possible. And so in the same way, if one who is himself untamed, undisciplined, then the text uses the word aparinibhuto, which literally means not extinguished, with the sense whose defilements are not extinguished, should tame another, discipline another, and help another extinguish his or her defilements. That is impossible. And so this doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to help others with the Dhamma until you're perfect yourself. But if you're not really trying to train or discipline yourself, and instead you're just letting yourself drift along with the unwholesome states, then don't think you can become a savior or enlightener of others. But then the text says that one who is himself tamed, disciplined, who has extinguished his defilements, should be able to tame, discipline, and help extinguish the defilements of another. That is possible. And then this is applied to all 44 types of behavior. Okay, so then the Buddha finishes the sutta by saying, the way of effacement has been taught by me. The way of inclining the mind or making a determination has been taught by me. The way of avoidance, of avoiding the unwholesome states and taking the wholesome path has been taught to me, by me. The way leading upwards has been taught by me. And the way of extinguishing defilements has been taught by me. And then he says, what should be done for his disciples out of compassion by a teacher who seeks their welfare and has compassion for them, that I have done for you. Here are the roots of trees. These are empty huts. Meditate, do not delay, or else you will regret it later. This is our instruction to you. And that is the end of the sutta. Okay, so now I'll ask whether there's any questions on anything that's arisen in the course of the sutta. Please feel welcome to us. Okay, no questions then. Oh, okay, there is. That's Matthew.
Thank you. One of the words of the ideas that was discussed here was generosity and miserliness.
Yeah.
Withholding. How? I don't see that.
Yeah. Wait, put the microphone.
The notion of generosity and,
Yeah.
and withholding from others, miserliness. Is that one of the defilements of the practice of effacement? I don't see it.
I think this would be included under what's translated here as under number 29, avarice. Avarice, the Pali word here is Majjhima, which means holding on to one's own possessions, not sharing them with others. And so the opposite of this is not, it's given in the negative, this is often done in the Buddhist text, non-avarice, which means lack of miserliness or stinginess, which will imply giving generously. I mean, often the text uses the word giving or generosity explicitly. Here, because the text is often, this text is formulated very often through the negative way, then it doesn't explicitly use the word generosity, but it's implied by non-avarice. Okay, I'll take this internet question. What is the difference between Sallekha or effacement, purification of mind, and breaking the 10 fetters? It seems that the way, first, this word Sallekha is not used very often in the Buddhist texts. It's a rather rare, it's rather unusual for the Buddha to use that word. And so it seems that this sutta is almost unique in giving a lot of attention to that word Sallekha. So it seems that this was a word, as I said at the beginning, that was sort of floating around amongst the different ascetic communities in the Buddha's time. And so the Buddha is taking this word and sort of adopting it into his own teaching, not with a very technical sense, but just as a cover term for this whole process of training the mind to eliminate unwholesome ways of behavior, thinking, reaction, and so on. And so it seems to have a very broad meaning within the Buddha's teaching and not a fixed technical meaning. Whereas purification of mind has or can have a more limited meaning, and that is the overcoming of the 5 hindrances as the preliminary stage towards attaining the jhanas, the meditative absorptions. And then breaking the 10 fetters, that refers technically to the stages of enlightenment or liberation that come when the wisdom eliminates the fetters or cuts off the fetters at their subtlest level so that they can never arise again. Okay, so this will end the discussion for today. And so we'll end with the sharing of the merits. Next week, I won't be here, so we won't have a class next week. But we'll come back and we'll have the next class. Today is the 2nd, the 9th I won't be here. The next class will be the 16th, correct? And did I put up the schedule for? Not yet. Okay, so I'll select the suttas and give you the class schedule. Heidi will put them up on the BAUS website, so please check the BAUS website. And we'll print out some copies next time. I'm sorry, I've been traveling around and a little busy with other things recently. Okay, so then we'll come back after the lunch and we'll have discussion from about 12, maybe a little after 12, till 12:30, if anybody has any further questions. Okay, so we end with the sharing of the merits. So I'll do the second set of 3 verses in the abridged form. Akasata chabumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mam param. Etavata cha amhehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe devanumodantu sabbe buddhanumodantu sabbe sadanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya bhavarupadhaya avichihitato etantare satakayo papanna rupi arupi cha asanya sanino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibhuting. Okay, thank you all again for braving the snow coming out here. I hope in 2 weeks